was really mind-boggling on your part to have encapsulated the entire theme which you did. Now may I request the Doyen of Indian Historians, my Ustad and Professor Emeritus in the university, not only the Professor Emeritus, but the pride of this university, Professor Irfan Habib, to come here and tell us about this.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, Professor Faizan Mustafa, Professor Nadeem Rizvi, delegates to the seminar, colleagues and young friends. Before I start, may I, after thanking Professor Faizan Mustafa for his kind words for me, act as a witness. When I was a student of Minto Circle, AMU High School, corporal punishment was very much in force until class 7. And I certainly suffered from it because I was an indifferent student. Spare the rod and spoil the child was very much the slogan. This seminar, as Professor Faizan Mustafa has already explained, wishes to see Syed Ahmad as a historian, an intellectual, and a man of reason. My concern in this address would be about his relationship to the cause of reason, because this is a very complex relationship. In 1795, Thomas Paine, the great revolutionary who had taken part in the American War of Independence and then in the French Revolution, wrote a book, wrote a tract, The Age of Reason. And that is therefore something like 22 years before Syed Ahmad was born. Throughout the 18th century, the age of enlightenment dawned in Europe. Rousseau was this particular figure, the author of Popular Will. Then in 1789, the French Revolution broke out. And the French Revolutionists proclaimed that they wanted to establish a regime of reason, a regime of liberty, equality, and fraternity, a regime in which all people in society would be equal. And in the next 4 years, they made men and women equal in civil law. Women had all the rights to property and in marriage that men had, and men had the further obligation of maintenance of women. So something which had never happened in the world before happened. And this was what Thomas Paine was celebrating. In other countries of Europe too, particularly in England, which was then governing India, large parts of it, things had changed. Adam Smith had created modern economics in which religion had no place. Gibbon wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1891, its final, in which Christianity, Islam were treated at par. He was neither Christian nor, he didn't believe in Christianity, but Christianity and Islam were there treated at par. His biography of the Prophet would be unexceptionable to any Muslim. So, secularism had already been created. Now, if you come to India, then you see that Ram Mohan Roy was very deeply influenced by the French Revolution. Many of its ideas were transmitted by Ram Mohan Roy. He did not accept the caste system. He said that patriotism is not possible in India if the caste system continues. He went to England. In his late life, he died there in 1833 and lies buried there. One of the causes why he went there was to plead the cause of the Bengal peasants against the zamindars. And as you know, the majority of Bengal peasants were Muslims and the majority of zamindars were Hindus, but that didn't matter to Ram Mohan Roy. Now, this is the atmosphere in which Syed Ahmad Khan was born in 1817 and got his education. I think we must understand that Syed Ahmad Khan's education, being totally traditional, was something which kept him away from all these ideas. Not only him away, but a very large number of educated people outside Bengal and Maharashtra were not aware of these ideas at all. And that is why you can notice such a big difference between Ram Mohan Roy's writings. Both he wrote extensively in English, and the writings of Syed Ahmad Khan, they seem to be at a different plane altogether. Ideas which were made acceptable by the French Revolution are to be found in Ram Mohan Roy, but they are not to be found in Syed Ahmad Khan for a long time, and in fact never at all, in some cases. So the first question is, why did this happen? And therefore we must look at Syed Ahmad Khan's education and his later encounter with reason. As I've said, his education was totally on traditional lines. Arabic, Persian, and considerable religious theology. Unfortunately, in Muslim sciences at that time, reason was in retreat. That those days had passed when you could have an Al-Biruni or an Ibn Sina. Even those days were past when under Akbar, Abul Fazl could say with pride that my son Abdul Rahman has a Greek temper. Greek temper meaning rational temper. Reason was in a total decline, and theology was ascendant, with Shah Waliullah and Shah Abdul Aziz and the Wahhabis. And Syed Ahmad Khan said with some pride, quite late in his life, that he was a Wahhabi. That you could see even in his Asarus Sanadid, the second portion, which is the Taskara portion, the biographies of eminent men of Delhi. His particular biography of Shah Ismail, in which he acclaims the jihad which was carried on by Wahhabis against Ranjit Singh with British support. Now, clearly therefore, Syed Ahmad Khan's break with orthodoxy came slowly and did not come easily. This began with his service with the English government as a clerk or an underclerk in 1837. He began to be acquainted with English methods of historiography and, as Professor Rizvi had said, archaeology. Therefore his first work, important work in 1847, Asarus Sanadi. But at the same time, he also wrote a book, a tract which is seldom mentioned, that is against the rotation of the earth. He was so religious that he believed that the earth cannot possibly rotate, the sun goes around the earth, but creating day and night. And he wrote in Persian a tract called Mateen Dar Abtale Harkat-e Zameen in 1840. So clearly it was from these foundations that his encounter with reason began. The rebellion of 1857 was an important event in his life, and it was a very important event in the life of millions of people in what is now Uttar Pradesh and Haryana. We don't now remember that probably hundreds of thousands of people were killed by the English when suppressing the mutiny. It was the greatest slaughter that had occurred in India for a long time. Syed Ahmad Khan was, of course, on the wrong side. He was on the British side. And he wrote two important tracts, which I won't discuss because I'm not really discussing him as a historian, but only from the point of view of his, from his approach, point of view of finding out his approach. In his story, in his history of his experiences of the rebellion at Bijnor, he supports the British government. He also takes pride in the fact that he incited Hindu zamindars against the Muslim leaders of the rebellion. He doesn't come out, comes out very loyal to the British, but otherwise he doesn't come out as a very clean operator. But he wrote everything and he gave documents and so on. So at least for that he can be praised. Then he wrote another book, Asbab-e-Bawaqt Hindustan, which he only wrote for English eyes. He assured the English that it was not, no Indian was allowed to see it. Asbab-e-Bawaqt Hindustan, in which he actually opposed criticized the tendency of the British to offer modern education, to offer secular education. That tract must be carefully read. He seems to be an opponent of reason by actually applying rational analysis to the causes of the rebellion, which is a very important fact. He is an important chronicler of the rebellion. But his point of view is extremely reactionary. That widows should not have right to remarry. That Hindus had been provoked by this. Why was it done? He didn't know, obviously, that Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar had said that even if all the Shastras say that widows should not remarry or should not be educated, I would say that they would be educated. That, I think, is a very great proclamation of reason. But he was not aware of it, nor was he aware of it that it was the demand of Bengal social reformers that Hindu women had got the right, widows had got the right to remarry. So it was from these beginnings that we find him taking a turn in the next decades towards an increasingly rational position. And in the short time I have, I would like very briefly to see how that happens. In both his tracts, the fact that rebel leadership was largely Muslim, although the actual soldiers were largely Hindu sepoys, comes out very clearly. And that is also in Asbab-e-Bawaqt, that Muslims occupied a major part of the rebel leadership. it is curious that later on he would contest it when for example, this point was made by Hunter in 1870s, then he would contest it. But if you read both of his tracts, this is quite obvious that the English were not wrong in saying that at least in this area, UP Muslims were in the main leadership. Well, of course, the sepoys were largely Hindu, those who actually died in battle had a very large Hindu component, perhaps the major component. But he became convinced now that Muslims must regain their position with the British government. And they must regain their position if they learned English, if they could serve the English government. And from these beginnings, therefore, he went for English education. The fact that he was denouncing in Asbab Baghavat Hindustan, that modern education should be given. And as you know, in Ghazipur, a school was established for this purpose when he was there. He became also convinced that these schools should not be vernacular or in Urdu language. At that time, Hindi was not so much in the picture. They should not be in Urdu, they should be English. They should teach English, because modern science and modern knowledge could only come from England. This, I believe, was put in an essay which he wrote in around 1862. I can't get the exact date from Hali, because Hali is really very careless about accurate dates in his major biography of Syed Ahmad Khan, but it was around 1862 that he finally took the position that English education must be imparted to Indians, particularly Muslims. And then he organized the Translation Society to translate English texts on mathematics and science in Urdu. This was later on called Scientific Society. But while pleading for modern education so that Muslims could enter service, it is remarkable that the social reform movement of Bengal doesn't seem to have had any influence on Syed Ahmad. It is sometimes painful when you read Syed Ahmad Khan about lower classes. For instance, in Asbab-e-Baghavat Hind, weavers, when he talks of Julaha, he says, Badzat Julaha. वो अंग्रेजों के खिलाफ उठ गए. Badzat or wretch is a harsh word to use for a poor person. In 1887 December, in the speech on which he got knighthood, he raises the caste issue and the class issue. How can a tailor's son, whom one we know, an Indian who is a tailor's son, how can he govern us if he passes an examination? If an Englishman, he is a tailor's son, we don't know whether he is a son of a tailor because he comes from England, but an Indian, no, it can't. So he was opposing the civil service examination, the proposal of the Congress that civil service examinations be held here. So it's surprising that the Bengal social reform movement had just no influence at all on Syed Ahmad. That is also explains what the dilemma that Professor Fazan Mustafa also had about his attitude towards women and about women's education. After all, 50 years before 1883, Ram Mohan Roy had died. It was not as if things had not happened in between, but Syed Ahmad Khan doesn't seem to have any, as I say, gone under any influence of the Bengal social reform movement. We must, therefore, when we celebrate Syed Ahmad Khan, also remember his limitations. It would be unfair and unacademic to forget those limitations. to him the main problem of reason was related to religion. If Muslims were to coexist as loyal subjects to the British government, then they must understand Christianity. And if they go about understanding Christianity, they must then apply reason. They must not say that the Christian scriptures, the Jewish and Christian scriptures, have undergone tahrif or change. And he set out to prove that the texts of these scriptures, whatever language they are in, have remained the same. The sense had remained the same. This work he started in 1860. And therefore, he wrote essays in which he proved that the beliefs of Christianity and Islam, major beliefs of Christianity and Islam are the same, and they are in the same tradition, and there has been no tahrif as far as the Christian scriptures are concerned. In a speech in 1884, what went for Christianity must also go for Islam. Therefore, if Christianity is to be studied in the light of reason, then so should Islam be so studied. And so he said in a speech in 1844, Islam needed to be established by means of rational arguments and scholarly means. That is to say, scholarly methods. That is to say, Islam must be seen in the same light as you see other religions, notably Christianity. It is again a vexing fact for me that Ram Mohan Roy had written an essay in Persian in 1803, in which he had argued that the basis of Islam and Vedanta in monotheism, based on monotheism, is the same. And therefore, he believed that monotheism must be the basis of all religion, and other ritual is unimportant. But this idea doesn't reappear in Syed Ahmad Khan. It's unbelievable that he should not have known about this essay, which was written in Persian, which was not written in English, which was Ram Mohan Roy's first work, and actually was the basis of Brahmo Samaj, in which he included both Hindus and Muslims, Christians, based on Unitarianism. But increasingly, this began to be plea of Syed Ahmad Khan also, but in relation not to Hinduism, but in relation to Christianity, Islam and Christianity, that both have the same basic beliefs. But here the problem was a different one, that the English did not have the same view of Islam. And that is why William Muir's biography was so troublesome. William Muir had written this biography not on Christian sources of biography of the Prophet, but on Arabic sources. He was an Arabist. He was also Lieutenant Governor of UP, Northwestern Provinces, and did give much help later to Syed Ahmad Khan, not minding Syed Ahmad Khan's criticism of him. Muir wrote 4 volumes based on Arab sources on the life of the Prophet. The problem was that what was good in Arab view was no longer good in 19th century. This was the essential problem. What the Prophet was praised in Arab sources was not something which Syed Ahmad Khan could now praise, or any people could now praise in the light of the whole moral changes that had taken place. This is the real problem with Muir's biography. There are other problems also. And this aroused Syed Ahmad Khan because this meant that Islam would get a bad name among Christians. And therefore, when he studied those Arab sources, gave a different interpretation of those sources or a different selection, and published a book in English criticizing Muir, in which Sayyid Mahmud, his son, helped, and then in Urdu, Khatmat Ahmadiyya in 1879. Actually, the controversy has become now antiquated, that it was at that time quite bitter. Because with Agnaz Gold-Zahir and other Orientalists, the Arab sources have been now criticized heavily. Their age has been fixed. The prejudices of their authors have been fixed. Hadith criticism was advanced by Gold-Zahir to a very high level, linguistically and so on. So the entire controversy between Muir and Syed Ahmad Khan is now over. Nobody goes to Muir's biography to read, to establish the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And therefore also the criticism that Syed Ahmad Khan levied on him. But this controversy led to another problem, the problem of Quran interpretation. Muir had recognized the Quran as a historical document. He did not believe that it, as some Christians argued, that it was corrupted, as Muslims said tahrif, they also said tahrif. He believed that the Quran was a solid document, and the Muslim Orthodox interpretation of the Quran was valid. Syed Ahmad Khan had to contest it. The Orthodox Muslim interpretation of the Quran was no longer in line with the ethical norms that the age of reason had now created. How can miracles, unnatural events, myths be accepted as history? And therefore, the real adventure in reason was Syed Ahmad Khan's thesis that if Quran was the word of God, then it could not contain anything which was against the laws of nature as established by science. This, I think, is the greatest contribution that can be attributed to Syed Ahmad Khan in the realm of reason. If the thesis is that Quran is the word of God, then how can it contain any statement which goes against the laws of nature, which God has established? And therefore, miracles, events which could not possibly have happened, must be ruled out. And therefore, Quran must be reinterpreted on that basis. And that is why his tafsir, he began to create his tafsir, which the first volume came in 1880, and the work was only half finished when Syed Ahmad Khan died in 1898. The tafsir was based on the formula that the word of God, and Syed Ahmad Khan uses these English words in his Urdu text, the word of God must conform to the work of God as understood by science. Now, when in 1892, Mohsinul Mulk, Mahdi Mohsinul Mulk, who was a great friend of Syed Ahmad Khan, asked him whether his views were the same as before. Because in the meanwhile, Syed Ahmad Khan had been driven out of the theology section of the MAO college. He had to say that he would not do anything, be concerned with theology teaching in MAO college. Only the Orthodox Sunnis and Shias would have control of theology. because there was an uproar about his work of God and Word of God thesis. So in 1892, Syed Ahmad Khan was asked by Mahdi Mohsin ul-Mulk whether he still believed in his theory. And Syed Ahmad Khan had been attacked very viciously, and as perhaps all of you know, Tafsir was never reprinted from the Aligarh Muslim University, MEO College or Aligarh Muslim University after Syed Ahmad Khan. It was denounced by Muslims. And Akbar Allahabadi, for instance, had put the Muslim protests against Sir Syed Ahmad in verse. I can only read, there's only time to read one share. समझा है तूने नेचर व तदबीर को खुदा. He's addressing Syed Ahmad. सैयद से आज हजरत वाइज ने ये कहा, समझा है तूने नेचर व तदबीर को खुदा. Syed Ahmad Khan was not saying that nature was God, he was saying nature was the work of God. But how things are distorted. समझा है तूने नेचर व तदबीर को खुदा, दिल में ज़रा असर न रहा ला इलाह का. So, this was there was a lot of abuse showered on Syed Ahmad Khan. है तुझने तर्क सौम सलातो ज़कात हज कुछ डर नहीं जनाब रसालत पनाह का. Although actually Syed Ahmad Khan had written a whole biography in defense of the Prophet. But Mohsin ul-Mulk thought that now in 1892 Syed Ahmad Khan would revise his views, but he had misjudged his man. Syed Ahmad Khan said that no, I stick to those views. Word of God cannot be different from the work of God. So Mahdi Mohsin ul-Mulk wrote back that science changes views every 25 years. So does it mean that the Word of God, the Quran, would also change its meaning every 25 years? And Syed Ahmad Khan replied that yes, it would. If our knowledge grows, the sense of the Quran would also change. So Mahdi Mohsin ul-Mulk said then that, can I print your letter? Can I publish the letter? He threatened him. Syed Ahmad Khan said, no, do please print it. Actually, I have already printed and distributed it at Agra. So, with all his limitations, I think we must honor our founder for the strength of conviction. You may consider his conviction wrong. You may consider that work of God has nothing to do with the Word of God. You may not print his tafsir from Aligarh Muslim University, but he stood for it, stood by it. Thank you.